Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. So this isn't too creepy, but it creeps me the hell out. I'm a 21-year-old female, and my uncle is much older than me. He's around his early 40s, and he is the youngest out of my dad's siblings. He saw me from birth up until I was 9, and he was okay with me as a kid, and he never did anything creepy to me as far as I could remember. However, when my parents were together, my mother always warned me not to get too close to my uncle. When I was 9, I moved away with my mother to a completely different city up the north, and she told me things about him and my grandfather. It really made me feel gross hearing them. However, I can't lie, I doubt her, as she had a tendency to exaggerate every story she told. Little did I know how right she was. When I became 18, my dad's family and I all met up in a city at that time. It was great. I saw my cousin, who was a year older than me, and we all catched up on what I missed. I interacted with my uncle again too, and I was friendly with him, just like everyone else in the family though. I regret it now because he saw my fun side, and that somewhat motivated him to interact with me more, to bring that side of me out again. He looked much older and had grew a large gut and become almost bald. It had surprised me, as he looked like your average TikTok star when he was younger. That meeting was okay. However, he began to act strangely with me afterwards. He'd always managed to find ways to touch me, such as putting a finger under my neck or chin to turn my face suddenly towards him, like in a cheesy rom-com or something. It was not in the NSFW areas, but he was always so touchy, and this for me was already a yellow flag, as our culture is strict and men don't touch women at all, even in friendly manners. None of my other female relatives have behaved like that in the past, except kind of my grandfather. So he made me feel weird, and I had forgotten all of what my mother had told me about them. One time, a particular incident occurred when I was at my cousin's house and he was there too. My memory is hazy, but I remember that he whispered a question about why I am so shy. And he was so close to my neck when he said it, which made me have cold sweat. He wouldn't leave me alone and kept asking me questions, forcing me to interact. Another thing in our culture is that women are told to be hospitable and, well, not cause a scene, as it is extremely shameful, and the woman is blamed even for legitimate reasons. He would always pull childish expressions at me whenever I accidentally would make eye contact with him, and I noticed he always kept staring right at me. The conversations he had would try to include me in some way, and he would ask me questions about it, even though I tried to make myself look busy. I think once, after he had breathed on me, I caught him looking through my purse when I was away from it, and he noticed and quickly acted as if he was doing nothing suspicious. Near the end of the day, I was on the sofa looking behind it and petting my cousin's cat, and my uncle was leaving and wanting to say goodbye. I didn't think much of it, as he usually would say goodbye and then just leave. However, he grabbed me by the waist and pulled me towards him. It felt pretty violating, as I was practically cornered due to the positioning of the sofa and him, and he said some things that I couldn't remember, as it was overpowered by the feeling of disgust that I had towards him, and also the panic. What he was doing was not allowed in our culture. Men did not grab women by their waist, not even husbands with their wives. I tried pulling back, but he grabbed me harder, and it felt like he was feeling my waist even more, and it freaked me out. And afterwards, he let me go. and left. I turned around and saw that my dad had partly seen the ordeal. When we got home, I told him everything about what happened, and my dad told me that it was a good thing that I came to him about it, and that he will talk to my grandmother about it so he can set him straight. However, sadly, nothing like that happened. To be honest, I knew that he wouldn't take it seriously due to how backwards our culture is, and I couldn't tell my cousins or aunt because they were extremely conservative as well, very slut-shaming, and would certainly blame me for it and not my uncle. My dad instead always kept a distance between my uncle, and he wouldn't let my uncle in the house if he knew that I was in tops that were not completely modest, and told me not to open the door to him if I was home alone with my brother. My uncle is still creepy sometimes. He was recording a video of my little cousin's birthday like everyone else, but he spent some uncomfortable amount of time just filming me, and I was obviously uncomfortable. My dad did call me towards him and has kept me under his watch whenever my uncle is near. Once, my uncle had come over and knocked like a wild man for us to open the door late so he could deliver us some food that our grandmother made, and did the same thing to our cousins. My dad has told him that we wouldn't open the door for him if we were home alone, but my uncle wasn't happy about that. The weird thing is that he had just had a baby though, and mysteriously, his wife never meets us or interacts with us. I also don't know why he chases after me specifically. He doesn't act like this with my cousin at all, and I am no looker. I wish I had listened to my mother from the get-go and had just steered clear from him since day one of meeting him again. I really hope someday that I can get away from him because I think he's really creepy. And sadly, I don't think he will get what he truly deserves due to my misogynistic culture. Before I begin, I should state that this was a few years ago, and I'm a tiny woman. Back at this time, I look like a teenager, so I've always been mindful that I seem an easier target or easier to fool. I had seen a job interview for a small business looking for a secretary, and no experience needed as they would provide on-the-job training. And as that's the kind of thing that I was looking for, I applied. I heard back quickly and I was invited to an interview. When I arrived, I was excited. It was a bit of a journey from my home, but it was in a beautiful old building on the 3rd floor with a modern layout inside, though you could tell that it was very new as it was bare bones and very little had been unpacked. Still though, if you have to work somewhere, might as well be in a nice building, right? Anyway, the interview seemed normal, and I only encountered female members of staff, and they were all warm and lovely. The woman interviewing me was amazing, and even sat talking to me for a while after, just getting to know me. When I get home, I wasn't in the door long before I got a phone call from them. I nailed the interview. Awesome, I thought, and I was offered the job. I was about to accept when I was told on the phone, "Okay, so you'll come here tomorrow and we'll have the van drive you to where you'll be working." And I was like, what? Confused about what they meant. Then they told me that I'd be meeting with the customers on their behalf, doing the talking, selling stuff, and etc. And I was not comfortable with this as it wasn't what I was interviewed for, but I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they had a second position that they thought that I'd fit in better with. It wouldn't be that weird as a new company, and while I was not comfortable with it, I should try to hear them out. So I asked more questions, and the woman on the other end of the line is getting more snippy and tense. and the nice friendly woman from earlier was gone. She would not reveal where I would be going or who I would be meeting. And by this point, plenty of red flags were going off, so I said no thanks to her offer. For anyone curious about what happened after, I reported this, and it seemed very dodgy. But when they were checked in on, the floor was no longer occupied by them, and they'd apparently just rented it for a week, and then they were gone. So, to the people who interviewed me, let's not meet again. Back in 2013, I had just started on an education, and after the first school period, I had to go out and find an internship to be able to progress. But at that time, it proved to be almost impossible to get one. So while I was looking, I decided to take another job just to make sure that we had food on the table. After searching for a while, I found out a friend of my fiance's family had his own handicap bus company, a kind of taxi service for wheelchair users or otherwise disabled people, and he needed someone to cover the night shift since it was a bus that had to be on call at least 22 hours a day. Seeing that I'm quite the night owl, I immediately told him that I'd be happy to take the job, and after I got the needed license, I was hired. The job was pretty basic: pick up people and drop them off where they needed to go, and sometimes use a machine to get the wheelchairs up or down some stairs. And when there were no trips, I drove to a designated area and I did whatever while waiting. I quickly found a truck stop in the area where I could park and I could catch some sleep while I was waiting. There was a gas station where I could buy coffee in the early hours of the shift. And on the other side of the gas station's parking lot, on the opposite side of the truck stop, there was a run-down restaurant with a motel connected to it. To not disturb the sleeping truckers if I got a trip in the middle of the night, I just usually parked on the restaurant side. After parking there every night for a while, I noticed one particular room had a lot of people come and go. In the beginning, I thought nothing of it. But then one night in the end of the summer, while I was half asleep with the window slightly open, I suddenly hear yelling coming from the motel, and a dude came tumbling out of the room, and a few seconds later, a big dude came running after him with something in his hand, and I could not make out what it was. I thought that it was none of my business, and I just went back to my half-sleeping waiting stage. Not much time passed and my phone went off. I had a trip an hour's drive away, so I turned on the bus, and I was leaving the parking lot when I saw the big guy coming around the corner, and the rest of the night I had back-to-back trips, so I didn't park until I got home. The day after, I didn't get a return to home zone until 2 or 3 a.m. And when I arrived at the parking lot, the area where I used to park, it had fist-sized rocks strewn all over the place. Not connecting the dots at that time, I just parked a few spots over and I started waiting. I fell asleep pretty fast, but was jerked back into reality when a car right in front of my bus honked its horn, flashed the high beams, and revved its engines at me. I thought that it was just some idiot who noticed me sleeping and found it funny trying to make me shit myself. So I jumped out of the bus about to tell him to fuck off. But instead of driving off or stopping, the driver made the start brake thing with the car, indicating that I was the one who should fuck off. And then I connected the dots. Not wanting to seem like a pushover, I stood still and I stared at the car. Not that I could actually see anything with the high beams almost blinding me. And after what seemed like a really long time, but must not have been more than 30 seconds. The car then drove off. And after that, I decided to park near the trucks from then on. A month or so passed and nothing had happened since the car episode that I had, and I figured that nothing more would if I just kept parking by the trucks. But then one night, I had a long 12-hour shift on a Sunday, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I didn't have time to eat dinner before work that day, and during the first half of my shift, I had back-to-back trips with no time to eat, so when I got a return to home zone, I quickly parked in the far end of the almost empty truck stop and then got ready to eat my now very late dinner that my fiancé packed for me. I wanted to watch some TV on my phone while I was eating, so I sat with my back against the driver's side door and I got very comfy. I was turning my back to the door and I accidentally hit the door lock with my elbow. But that was my luck. As I was sitting there scrolling through Netflix on my phone, I suddenly felt the bus rock and heard the clack of the door handle behind me smack back in position. I quickly turned and I saw a dude with a hood over his head quickly crouching and proceeding to lay down on the ground and crawling under the bus. Well, of course, with a big-ass kitchen knife in his right hand. I quickly got up and made sure the two other doors were locked, and then I looked in all directions to see if I could spot him. He was still under the bus and I was sure as hell not jumping out this time since the knife made his intentions pretty clear. I turned on the engine, turned on the spots on the back of the bus, and looked around to see if it had scared him off. And lucky for me, it did. I saw him run off and into a bushy or woody area at the end of the truck stop. And I never parked at that truck stop again after that night. And I also made sure that all doors were locked every time that I was parked. A little about me. I'm a personal trainer, and I share a space in an office that also has an acupuncturist and a chiropractor. Usually, they operate during the day, and I would go around 7 to 8 p.m. at night to work out and do some heavy lifting, so their clients don't have to hear metal clinking or banging in another room. As a preface, every once in a while, the door will unlock and the cleaning person will come in. The door will chime and they will clean and then leave. The family that cleans the building is Hispanic. Usually a taller man who is very nice will clean our office, and a woman, who I assume is his wife, will walk around with a trash bag and pick up the other buildings in the area. And tonight was the usual routine. Go to the office, drop off some paperwork, and squeeze in an evening workout. I'm putting away some stuff and printing off a few things when I hear the door unlock. The door is older and it makes a very distinct click sound when the key turns in it. The door chimes and a man comes in asking me in Spanish if he can come in. I don't speak Spanish, and he repeats in English. "Can I come inside?" Of course, I think it's one of the members of the family to come clean, and I say yes. It isn't until 10 minutes later, after I go to throw away something, I notice the trash is still there, and this man is just sitting in front of the door. I didn't want to be rude, but I didn't understand why that on the Sunday night at 8:30 p.m., this guy is just sitting here in the office alone with me. I text the chiropractor and I tell her what's going on, to which she calls me immediately and says, "You need to leave. There is a button on the alarm to notify the police. Do you want me to come over?" I tell her yes, and I grab my stuff and I approach the man. I tell him, "I'm leaving for the night and I'm turning on the alarm, so you need to leave." He looks up at me, and then he shakes his head and says no very firmly. I freeze up, thankful that I still have someone on the phone. I say, "Why are you here?" He mumbles something along the lines of, I am on probation." I tell him that the office isn't for probation, and in my mind, I am thinking, why would someone be reporting to an officer at 8:30 p.m. on a Sunday? The office is holistic. We have Buddhas and incense around, and it says Oriental medicine on the door. He then stands up and blocks the door. He starts asking what the office really is, and I tell him that it's for an acupuncturist and other specialties. As I type this, I wonder why he cared to know. It wasn't for probation. Why would he care so much to know what the office was? I wonder if I made a mistake in telling him. He then pulls out his phone and begins to scroll through it. He says he doesn't know the address and maybe I can help him, suggesting that I walk over to peer at his phone. I tell him that I can't help him and that he needs to leave. He scrolls for 5 minutes on his phone, and at this point, I'm hoping the Chiro will get here soon. He holds his phone up at me and shows me a random list of 20 to 30 addresses. I tell him, maybe what you're looking for is across the street, but not here. You need to leave." He seems hesitant to leave, but finally turns around and walks out slowly. And as soon as he gets outside, I lock the door. I guess it didn't matter, because this man somehow had a key and then got in. But I locked that door as soon as I could. It was only then that I noticed that there was a van parked in front of my car outside. This man gets in the passenger side, so he isn't alone. I decided to wait until the car leaves before I get in my own car. The way they were parked, it would only take them backing up 5 feet to box me into the space. The van is huge with suicide doors on the back, and it then proceeds to wait for 15 minutes before slowly pulling out. It stops in front of the office as if they are taking one last look at the building, and then slowly pulls off. I wait, and I noticed that they have only pulled up 50 feet just out of my sight. They are still there, and I can barely see the headlights. It's like they are waiting for something. And thankfully, the chiropractor pulled up in her car in time, and the van was gone. The whole experience was unreal. I can't seem to wrap my head around it. The fact that this man came in with a key and acted like he was there for probation doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense at all. The fact that he wanted to know what the office really was, and he blocked the door is also bizarre. A few weeks ago, when I was moving equipment into the space, I felt like I was being watched. I ended up burning some sage, and I thought maybe I was just paranoid about being in a new space at night. But now I'm wondering if there was something that I was picking up on and I just didn't know it yet. I will keep this updated as things progress. Hopefully, that man doesn't come back, and hopefully, we get a security camera installed and also the locks changed. So this happened at the end of summer 2021, and I was reminded because of Facebook memories. A little context: from ages 16 to 19, I was being abused by my ex and his mother, Monica. I lived with them because I was kicked out and she had power of attorney over me. Her name wasn't Monica. It was a super unique name that I haven't seen anyone else have before. It was a Friday night in the middle of a neighborhood filled with bars and clubs, so me and my fiancé wanted to go out. I got all dolled up and my fiancé went to the bar about 30 minutes before me, so he could grab some food from a pizza place near the bar. And once I finished getting dressed, I hopped out of my apartment and I started heading to the bar that was like 3 blocks away. I noticed a homeless woman outside my apartment, but I just shrugged it off. There were always homeless people in my neighborhood since it was downtown. And as I walked past her, I heard her turn and start walking behind me. It definitely creeped me out, but I assumed that she was just heading my way or was gonna ask me for some cig or maybe money. But no, what happened sent a shiver down my spine. "Monica? Monica!" the woman called to me in a raspy smoker's voice. I froze. I hadn't heard that name in years and I was terrified. I took a deep breath, assuming that she had confused me for someone, and it's a big coincidence, so I turned back to her and smiled. "Oh, sorry ma'am, I'm not Monica. I'm Lilac. Hope you find Monica though. Have a good night." And I turned to walk away. No, Monica. I know who you are," she said as she grabbed my shoulder and turned me towards her again. I was frozen in fear at this point and finally got a good look at her up close. She was probably in her early 60s, brown hair with grown-out gray roots. She had on multiple layers of coats and ripped scrub pants. But what was most noticeable was her eyes. They were dark and her pupils were so large that they almost engulfed the dark brown iris. Before I could respond, she looked deep into my eyes and said in a calm voice, "Are you ready to die tonight, Monica?" I instantly went into fight or flight mode and I smacked her hand off my shoulder and I turned to run to the bar, my hand in my purse on my pepper spray if she tried to follow me. She didn't. Instead, she just laughed and laughed. I could hear her laugh echo in my ears along with her question as I ran into the bar. I found my fiancé and just broke down sobbing. He calmed me down and got me a drink, then walked me home a couple of hours later to make sure that she wasn't there. The next morning, I heard from a neighbor that the sports bar across the street from the bar that I went to had a fatal shooting out front about 2 hours after I left. A man shot and killed 1 person and hurt 2 more. He was arrested 6 months later and was connected to another bar shooting a month prior where only 1 person was injured. The shooting seemed completely random, and I never saw that woman again, and I moved a few months later. Earlier, I was on my way to work and I stopped into a nearby gas station to grab a drink and a snack. As I am approaching the drink area, there is a normal-looking guy. And by normal-looking, I mean that from my perspective, there was nothing off-putting about him, and he just looked like a nice person. And he was just standing there. I see that it's a visibly tight space between him and the fridge doors, so I say, "Excuse me," so that I could politely walk by towards the water that I was eyeing up. As I go past him, he says, "What do you think this is?" As someone who has a sense of humor, I thought he was joking or giving me a hard time, so I just laughed and proceeded to grab the water. But then I see him staring at me out of my peripheral vision. So I looked over, and he is giving me a blank, menacing stare. The smile was wiped off my face very quickly, and I said, "What?" out of confusion. He then continues to stare at me and just says, "Yeah," almost as if he was implying that he was telling me off or making a point or something. I just tried to ignore it and I proceeded to grab a snack. As he approaches the register to check out, I overhear him say to the cashier, "I feel like people are following me today." To which the cashier responds, Who?" And he then repeats, "I feel like people are following me today." I then get in line behind him, and he very much intentionally drops his license, his debit card, and some other card. They drop behind him towards me, and he then turns around and just looks at me. He looks down at the cards and then back up at me. He slowly bent down to pick them up while staring at me, and then proceeded to leave the gas station while looking back. I have no idea what I just experienced, but it was very unsettling. I didn't say anything negative to him, nor was I rude in any manner when I was trying to move by him in the gas station. I did not follow him whatsoever, nor did I give him any reason to drop his personal cards behind him towards me. So I am continuing to ask myself, why did this man act this way? And why did I feel such a menacing energy during my entire time in there? I don't expect anyone to give me a specific reason as to what I experienced, but I just really needed to share what happened. This occurred in 2009. I was 22 years old and I was leaving my home state of California to head east for my corrections job. I was driving down the loneliest highway portion of the route, and it was around 3 a.m. on a Sunday. They don't call it the loneliest highway for nothing. I hadn't seen another soul for at least half an hour. I was getting sleepy, but I wasn't tired enough to pull over and take a nap. That's when I saw a broken down car on the side of the highway. I slowed, and I saw a woman standing next to the car. I approached this woman with caution, rolling down my window just a sliver. Something about her wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I know that it was my subconscious screaming red flag. I asked her if she needed me to call a tow truck or AAA for her, and she immediately tried to open my door. I explained to her that I didn't feel comfortable letting her in, but that I would wait until a tow truck came. Well, she immediately got this look of rage on her face, and she started berating me. She said, "Huh, you're a big man. What am I going to do to you?" And she said that I was cruel for not letting her in. This is where I mess up. I can see this now 10 years later. I begrudgingly unlock my door, figuring that she's right. She's at most 5'2" and I'm over 6 feet, and have 100 pounds over her, and she looked to be about 90 pounds or so. She slips in, and I ask her who I can call. This was 10 years ago, so I had a little BlackBerry slide, I think, at that time. She then starts telling me that she would prefer if I just gave her a ride to the next town. Now, I'm starting to realize that I've done messed up because she's avoiding eye contact and she's fumbling in her purse, and when I mention calling for help, she's getting aggressive and demanding that I take her to the next town. I'm so busy trying to unfuck the situation that I miss a man who either was hiding in or near her car, and it wasn't until he was almost to my driver's side door that I managed to catch him in my rearview mirror. Flight or fight kicked in, and I put my car in drive, and I sped off right as this fucker was reaching for my car door. I sped off, and I heard a ping noise. and then my rearview mirror exploding. He was shooting at me. The adrenaline alone had me doing near 90, and by this time, homegirl realized in whatever drug-induced stupor she was in that her little plan was futile. She started hitting me and telling me to stop and let her out. When I reached enough of a distance, I did just that. I pulled over and then I demanded that she got the hell out. She started going for that oversized purse she had, but I had had enough and I was literally shaking with adrenaline, and I reached over, opened the door, and pretty much shoved her out. I tried grabbing for her purse, but she managed to hold on to it, not before dumping half of what it was in there on my passenger seat. I sped off and my door was still open. I waited till I got a good distance from her, and then I slammed it shut and locked it. I clenched the wheel and drove, if on something autopilot. It wasn't until later that morning that I pulled into a Denny's and did I realize how close I was to pretty much dying. I had a good cry and then realized a bunch of her things spilled onto my passenger seat. Most of it was nasty wadded up napkins, a few tubes of lipstick, and also drug paraphernalia. I had considered calling the cops or finding a highway patrol officer. I did do something stupid. I tossed all of her things that had fallen into a trash bag, and then I threw them away. At that time, I had a dream of becoming a cop, and I knew that if I got caught with drug paraphernalia, then that dream would be impossible. I didn't think they would believe me that the drug paraphernalia wasn't mine. I noticed a cop at the gas station across from the Denny's, and then I told him what happened. He pretty much berated me for pulling over and then letting her in. He did say, though, that he would look into it, but I doubt that he did. I was so shaken that I pretty much picked at my pancakes, and then I left to continue on my way. I never did replace that mirror, and I ended up selling my car, as where I lived didn't require me to have one. Till this day, 10 years later, I hesitate to stop and help stranded motorists. This story takes place a few years back when myself, my sister, and her 2 kids were all driving to a surprise birthday party for my older brother Matt. It was a bit of a drive, and we were actually going to be on the road for probably 10 hours heading east. But the drive was worth it because it was his first birthday back after having been deployed overseas, and he had only been home for around a month. And basically, we knew it was going to be a pain in the ass to get all the way out to our parents' house, but it was 100% worth it to see Matt, since it had been somewhere close to a year since we last saw him, and it seemed like he should be able to celebrate his birthday with his whole family. And like I said, the drive out east was going to take around 10 hours, and my sister and I were both adults, and my nieces were around 4 and 7. My sister drove for the first half, and I said that I would take the second half, as I knew that at 5 hours in, she would likely be in the back seat, keeping the little ones calm and collected. 4 and 7 are old enough to enjoy these kinds of car rides, but definitely not old enough to sit for 10 hours straight. And I honestly don't blame them. If it weren't for Matt, I wouldn't have sat through the trip myself. We got through my sister's half without any issue, and by the time I was getting behind the wheel, it was starting to get dark out. My sister sat in the back with the nieces, and somewhere around an hour or 2 into my half, she ended up falling asleep. The younger of my 2 nieces also fell asleep, but the older one, Courtney, was wide awake and watching all the things we were driving past. And while it may not sound like a thrilling adventure to drive with two people sleeping in the back seat and having random passing conversations with a 7-year-old, I really thought it was fun. We were about an hour away from my parents' house when the actual event happened, and that's honestly what I have to call it, an event. Mostly because I honestly don't know what actually happened. So, as stated, my sister and the youngest were sound asleep, and we were about 9 hours into a 10-hour drive. I was watching the highway and my speed, and just basically having a nonsense conversation with my niece. I think it was about some cartoon that she was really into at that time. And as I am watching the highway for the most part, every once in a while, I glance up at the mirror and look at her. This is actually when the whole thing happened. I looked up in the mirror and said something to her. Then I glance back down and I see what I can only explain as an absolutely blinding white light. As soon as my eyes hit forward, I saw this seriously bright and all-encompassing flash of white. My first thought was that it was an oncoming car or something like that. But I just remember that immense and horrible sense of panic flooding through my body. What was weird, whatever it was, I never hit it. I thought that we were going to smash into it, and I remember screaming. Hell, I even recall hearing my niece screaming. But it apparently never happened. It kind of felt like whatever that moment in time when I saw the light, it kind of hung there for a moment, and then reset back to me on the road, driving like normal. I didn't swerve, I didn't slam my brakes, and I apparently didn't scream because the other two never woke up. I went from staring down an alarmingly bright light in front of me going 70 down the highway, certain that I was on a collision course with whatever the hell it was, to driving like normal with nothing in front of me. Of course, that feeling of terror didn't pass, and I was still running high on adrenaline when I came back to reality. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, and I tried to take deep breaths. When I stopped the car, my sister obviously woke up asking if we were at the hotel yet. I told her no, and that I just needed to take a moment to catch my breath. She asked if something happened, and before I could even respond, my niece starts telling her that we were talking about the cartoon, and then there was this really bright light in the middle of the road that just randomly disappeared. Her version was probably cuter and more detailed at that time. This actually made it worse though, because she confirmed what I saw. I saw all of this unfold and she saw it too, which confirmed that I didn't fall asleep or have one of those micro nap things that you can have while driving. I legitimately saw this huge white light in the middle of the highway. And unfortunately, there is no way for me to explain the whole resetting thing. So I just left it at what she said. I told my sister that I wasn't sure what it was and that it just freaked me out a little bit. Nothing else happened the rest of the way. We all stayed awake and chatted for the last 40 minutes or so. We then got there and had a great time. And while the party was certainly the highlight of the whole event, that was seriously a road trip that I'm not likely to forget anytime soon. So this literally happened 30 minutes ago. I'm driving to work and it's about 3:30 a.m. I take 3 different routes to work, but I've been taking the same one for a while since there's construction everywhere else. I'm driving down this road and on either side of the road is all subdivisions. I'm listening to a podcast, trying to keep myself awake until I can go get some coffee. I start getting this uneasy feeling in my stomach, but I thought it was just my body telling me to get some caffeine and maybe something to eat. But I ignore it and I continue driving. All of a sudden, this guy starts running out in the middle of the road. I barely see him since he's wearing dark clothes. I manage to slow down and I notice that he looked pretty freaked out. Now, I listen to a lot of creepy podcasts ranging from true crime to supernatural, and I know the rules to stay safe in situations. Well, I wish I listened to them today. I normally wouldn't stop, but I knew that if something happened to me, I would want someone to stop, and so I did. Luckily, I kept my car running, and I rolled my window down a little bit just so I can talk to this guy. I asked him if he was okay, and he starts freaking out saying that someone was trying to kill him. He told me his dog was ripped apart in his front lawn, and he tried to pick the remains up to try and bury it, but he saw a man running after him with a knife. He said he thought it was probably a coyote or something, so he wasn't suspicious, but he ran off when he saw this man. Now, I was pretty freaked out, but I noticed something. Yeah, it was dark, but with the lights on inside my car and the lights that were on out front of the subdivisions, I could see pretty well. He was younger, about mid-30s, dark black hair and green eyes. He was wearing a hunter's jacket and jeans. I lived in Idaho, so hunter's jackets is pretty normal attire. What I noticed, however, is that there was no blood or fur anywhere on him. I asked him why there wasn't any blood on him, and his whole demeanor changed. It was like turning off the switch. My blood went cold. He stared at me for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a couple seconds. And what came out of his mouth next was the final straw for me. His whole body relaxed. He stopped shaking, and he leaned closer towards my window and smiled at me. It was a twisted type of smile, and his eyes went dark. He took a deep breath and said, "I was going to help you." He then started cackling and tried to open my car door, and I immediately rolled up the window and put my car in drive and sped off down the road. I was not stopping for anything. And once I finally got to work, I started crying. I still had 10 minutes before I have to go in, and honestly, I'm terrified to get out of my car. So to the guy that wanted to help me, let's not meet ever again. This happened a few years ago during a hiking and camping road trip that my sister and I were taking during my last summer vacation. Basically, the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. She had already graduated 2 years back and was about to go out to college, so she wanted to go out and have a week to ourselves one last time for my last summer break. Obviously, we had to take extra precautions at my parents' request. We were 2 late teenage girls, and the world can be a genuinely terrifying place. So basically, we had to keep them up to date on where we were at all times, call them if anything happened, and keep ourselves armed with mace and all of that. I get where they were coming from, but at the same time it was a bit annoying having them writing rules for our road trip. Aside from that, we were told that we needed to stay on main routes and in large parks during our hiking. Honestly, that wasn't a big deal to me. I knew of a few large lakes with really beautiful scenery around them, and I had one in mind that I wanted to go see. Lake Tahoe. It's the largest alpine lake in the US and is nestled right on the border of Nevada and California. And if you've never been there, you need to go, or at least look up pictures that people have posted of it, because it is heavenly there. We have decided that this would be our main destination as we live in Twin Falls, Idaho, and Lake Tahoe is literally across the diagonal of Nevada. Most of the trip went swimmingly. We chose to actually go east a bit down to Salt Lake City, and then cross Nevada on Interstate 80. This way, we got to see two really cool places, and we were on a main highway the entire way. It was a road trip, and we were supposed to take in the sights really, so that's what we did. We stopped and enjoyed the open air several times across the state, and we thought that it was such a lovely time. The part of this that makes this a scary story is when we actually got to Lake Tahoe. When we got to the area, we had to make a bit of a decision. The campgrounds weren't going to be available as they fill up fast during this time of year. And honestly, I wasn't much for camping, so we decided to find a place that had a parking lot with cars each night to spend the night in. The main place we chose was the Walmart in Carson City. It was about half an hour away, but it was relatively safe, and we weren't likely to get told to leave if we kept it on the down low. This whole thing started the second night of us staying at the Walmart, or the morning rather. We were both asleep when we heard a knocking on the window. I woke up and I looked over, and there was a random guy standing by my sister's window. I shook her, thinking it was possibly a police officer or an employee telling us that we needed to leave the property. She wakes up, rolls down the window, and asks if she can help him. He kind of introduces himself. He just kind of shyly says that his name is Frank and that he's homeless, and also a bit of a drifter. He then makes a remark like, "You two ladies aren't from around here, are you?" I was a bit concerned, but my sister retorted with, "What makes you say that?" It was pretty clear that he was able to get the hint that she wasn't going to be intimidated, but he also wasn't trying to be intimidating. He kind of laughed and just said, "Oh, well, your license plate says Idaho, and you're sleeping in a Walmart parking lot." That kind of dropped my sister's defenses a bit, mostly because her aggression was a bit unwarranted and, well, a bit dumb. Anyways, this interaction ended up with him asking us if we were heading back up northeast to Idaho. We told him that we weren't, and that we were going to be in the area for a few more days, and that we were spending a lot of our time at the lake. He seemed to be a bit annoyed, but then asked if he could catch a ride out to the lake with us this morning, and that he would give my sister $20 if we could get him there, and that's all he would need. I don't know if it was the money or just my sister feeling like an idiot with her whole thing a few minutes prior, but she told him that he could hop in and that we would take him there at that time. I just kind of stared at her like, "What the hell are you doing?" But she dismissed me and said that he just needed a quick ride and that I needed to be more trusting of people. Anyways, we helped him load his belongings, which was pretty much just a tent and a few groceries, into the truck, and then we headed off toward the lake. On the way there, which really wasn't much time, this guy started telling us all about who he was. He said his name was Frank, that he was actually from New Mexico originally, and that a few months back, his wife had tragically suddenly passed away. He said that she was pregnant, and when she passed away, they couldn't save the baby too, and that it completely devastated him. He mentioned that, ever since it happened, he has been trying to find himself, and that he ended up a bit of a vagabond, traveling places and just living out in nature, and that it was the happiest that he has ever been. It was a bit weird that this guy was all about telling us who he was, what his life was about and all that, but at the same time, maybe he just didn't have anyone to talk to. We drove up to the lake and into one of the lots, basically where we planned to park for the day, and the guy thanked us for the ride and handed my sister an old and torn up $20 bill. We all get out and are looking around the area. He grabs his camping gear and heads out into the woods without another word to us. And then we decide that we're going to head in the opposite direction on the trails and spend the day around the lake. Now, if this was where it ended, that would be fine. But it's not. Not at all, actually. We were at the lake for a couple more days before we had to make our way back, and on the last day, we actually drove back to the same lot that we dropped the guy off at. We went off into the forest area, and we actually ended up near a clearing. And in the clearing, we see a small green tent, one that's identical to the one that the guy we dropped off was carrying. Except, this tent was torn up. It was halfway pulled out of the ground, the cloth was cut up, and there was a number of papers strewn around the area. We walked up to it to see if he was in what was left of the tent. But the only things that were left were a bunch of photographs that were damaged, and what appeared to be blood in the bedding that was in the tent. Obviously, we were a bit taken aback by this, but there wasn't much that we could really do. My thought was that he may have been attacked by a bear, but if that was the case, then he was gone. My sister thought that maybe another vagabond attacked him, but really, all we could think to do was call the cops and let them know that there was a tent with blood, mostly because the blood meant something bad had happened. We called them, we made our report, and then moved back onto the trail and spent the last day at the lake. The next day when we were on our way home, we actually got a phone call from one of the police that had taken our statements. He asked us if we could come in and give some more information. But unfortunately, by the time he called, we were already several hours back into the state, and turning around would set us back by almost the full day. Thankfully, the officer understood and asked if we would just conduct the interview over the phone. My sister pulled over, she put her phone on speaker, and we had a quick conversation with the officer. It was pretty standard as far as conversations go. He asked us if we knew the individual that owned the tent that we had reported. We informed him that we didn't know anything beyond his name being Frank and that he was homeless. He asked us how we knew the individual, or more so how we had met the individual. We told him that he asked for a ride from the Walmart down the lake, and the more questions he asked, the more it felt like he was trying to associate us with him, and I ended up basically just telling him that we really didn't know this guy, that we had only seen him that one time, and that we had no idea where he was. That's when he dropped the bombshell on us. They knew where he was. They actually found his body in a shallow section off the lake in a small cove. He informed us that they went out to look after we called it in, and after doing a sweep, they found him floating in the lake. He then informed us that the blood in his tent appeared to be his, and that his cause of death was being listed as suicide. It had appeared that he had injured himself and then wandered into the lake and drowned. He then informed us that Frank was actually wanted by the police back in New Mexico in connection with his wife's death. Apparently, they believed that he had killed his wife and their unborn child, and they had been looking for him ever since. The purpose of the call was to basically clear us and make sure that we didn't really know this guy, and satisfy the investigators that we didn't have anything to do with his death. So yeah, that's the story of the one time that I went to Lake Tahoe and the last time that my sister and I took a road trip. Also, the last time that she gave a ride to someone that she didn't know. Thankfully, he didn't seem like an absolute psycho, but the fact that he was wanted in connection with his wife's death really freaks me out, especially since I was sitting right in front of him. It's actually almost terrifying how normal he seemed, especially considering what he'd done and how he was living his life. As for why he ended his own life, my guess is that he couldn't take it anymore, and that the lake was just the right opportunity. It's an unfortunate situation, and I don't think that I'll be forgetting my summer at that lake for a very long time. For the sake of the story, I don't recall every word of my conversations in this story. It was 15 years ago, so I will do my best to recreate them to make the story flow based on what I do remember. I was about 19 when I was offered a job by my cousin to work for our uncle's glass business. They install giant glass windows in tall buildings and skyscrapers. Not that it's too relevant to the story. The catch to the job was, I had to temporarily move to Destin, Florida from Tampa. My cousin lived up in Russellville, Alabama, and I wanted to go visit the family there and leave with them together to go back down to Destin. This was my first long-distance road trip and my first trip away from my immediate family. Back then, I was driving a puke green Mercury Sable, a car barely capable of getting groceries back home. But in my invincible youth, I didn't care about that. I was just so pumped to be spreading my wings and getting out into the world that the risk didn't concern me. My mom and dad tried to get me to plan and pack better, knowing the trip could have its pitfalls. But it wasn't like the trip was going to take days, and fast food exists, so I wasn't stressing about that. I mean, I'm not stupid. I packed for the trip and staying for a few months in Destin. But they wanted me to bring food, water, emergency supplies, and etc. And I declined because it wasn't the 1930s, and of course, there were gas stations at every exit, and I had a razor flip phone. My thinking was, what could possibly happen on two busy interstates? It wasn't like I was going to some far-off country with no kind of self-service. Well, anyway, fast forward to the trip, and I'm a Florida boy. I had no idea Alabama could get so cold. I had no idea the heat was broken in my car, since I had never used it. At first, I'm thankful because by the time that I reach Alabama, I'm tired as hell, and I had made a lot more stops than I anticipated. I still had a few hours to go, and the cold air was keeping me awake. Finally, I pull off the interstate and start heading through these smaller numbered roads. The roads didn't have conventional names like in Florida, they were just numbered, which I really found odd. And after driving on those a bit, I start being sent down gravel roads. This was the days of MapQuest, so I didn't have a GPS guiding me through just paved roads or rerouting me around roadblocks. I was starting to get hungry and thought back to my parents telling me to pack food. I should have listened. The sketchiest thing with MapQuest was that you just printed out the directions. You didn't have a map to fall back on, so going out of your way to find fast food and an exit came with the potential of legitimately getting lost. So I had passed a few signs telling me to turn off for food because I was tired and I didn't want to chance it. Instead, I was looking for something off the side of the road that I could easily pull in and pull back out with no fuss. And more importantly, no risk of getting lost. My prayers were answered a little down the road when I saw a beat-up old country grocery store on my right-hand side. It didn't even have a name. It just said, "Grocery," across the front of the white building. I pulled in because the light shining across the grocery sign was on, but I found it odd that most of the lights inside were off. This gave me the creeps a little, but it didn't stop me from going up that door. I was starving, and maybe this was a 24-hour place. I saw a shadow move across the back of the long aisles as I approached the glass door, and surprisingly, it opened. At this point, I half expected them to be closed, well, mainly due to the lack of lighting inside, and I hoped an owner would take pity on a tired traveler and let me grab some snacks. I called out, hello?" No one answered. I said something along the lines of, "I saw you when I had pulled up and I was hoping you're still open." Again, no answer. Now, this was really naive of me, but I assumed that maybe the owner was older and couldn't hear me. Or maybe he was deaf, so I went further back into the store. It honestly didn't smell great inside, and I hoped they had at least some chips or something. At least those were sealed. And then suddenly, a man emerged from the back and said, "I'm so sorry. We were just about to close. How can I help you?" he asked with a smile. He nearly made me jump out of my skin at first, but he seemed friendly enough. Not the old man that I was picturing, but actually a younger guy, maybe in his 30s. "Yeah, I just came up from Florida. It's really been a long drive. I was hoping you guys had something to eat for the trip." "Oh, we have plenty. What are you looking for exactly?" he said, without taking his eyes off of me. The guy had a weird unblinking stare that put me on edge. But what made me the most uncomfortable was his smile. He smiled big, but his eyes never moved. As in, the only way you could tell he was conveying an emotion was by looking at his mouth. The rest of his face stayed the same. Most people you could tell that they're smiling, even if their mouth was covered, because you smile with your whole face. But not this guy. "Just some chips, maybe a Coke. Do you have Doritos?" I said. "Of course," he said, walking past me. He locked the door behind me before turning and smiling. "Well, we don't want anyone else walking in," he chuckled. Him locking the door was creepy, but I shrugged it off because the reasoning was sound, even though it felt really off. "Follow me," the guy said, as he walked towards the back of the store. I was young, but I should have been smart enough to know that the store owners generally don't give their customers a tour around of the store. But I had lived a pretty sheltered life, and I could feel that something was off, but I didn't want to offend by asking questions like, "What's that smell?" We get to the back of the store, to where those plastic flaps hang that separate the customer's side and the back end. When the man sticks his hand through, parting the plastic and says, "Right this way." Now, Alarm bells are starting to go off in my head, especially as he starts looking around and past me, like someone who is selling drugs and watching out for the police. "Back there?" I ask, and I start to back up a little. That's when I notice Chips beside me on the aisle. The guy noticed me see the chips and says, "Yeah, back here. We got our good stuff in the back. You can come take your pick." And by this time, I find the source of the buzzing. Flies are flying over the meat section, and the dim light reflecting off the packaging lets me know that it's been sitting there for a while. "I'll just take this if that's alright," I said nervously as I grab a bag off the shelf next to me, and I start backing up towards the door. No, trust me, those are no good. I have way better stuff back here." He smiles, gesturing for me to head back. I fake patting my pockets and say, "Oh man, I forgot my wallet in my car. I'll be right back." As soon as the words left my lips, I spun around and did a light jog to the front, increasing with speed as I approached the door. I make it to the door and twist the lock a couple of times until I hear the click. I push the door open and I turn back to look at where the man is, but he's gone. I jumped into my car and I sped out of the parking lot, and I didn't stop again until I reached my cousin's house. This was back in 2015, where I was 16 years old. I'm male, by the way. This was in the summer, where both my parents went to visit some of our relatives out of town, and they would not be home for 3 days. I was the only child, and I was the only one left in the house. My grandma did visit me every single day to make me lunch. They did not ask that of her, since I did know how to cook, but who can stop her, right? But of course, she didn't stay during the nights. And that's when I went wild, watching movies, gaming, watching YouTube, everything you could picture a 16-year-old doing when his parents aren't home. So the second night I was watching a movie and I ran out of chips. I paused the movie and I went down in the kitchen to grab some more. But that's when I hear a window break and a door opening. The kitchen was separate from where the living room was, where the door has been opened. I grab a knife and I slowly peek my head around. And there he was, a tall man around 2 meters, 6 feet, and had a baseball cap, some old jacket, probably leather, and it was torn on the right sleeve. My phone was in the room upstairs. From the kitchen door, the stairs were directly to its right, so in my dumb mind, I was thinking that I could sneak past him and then lock myself in. He was going through the shelf next to the door, very loudly I must say, and so I got to the stairs somehow. And then he turns around and then realizes that I was there. Out of fear, I guess, I screamed and I threw the knife at him. I missed him, but it hit the wall beside his head, sticking the knife in there. I guess he got scared by me, my savage screaming and the throw, so he ran out before I could grab another knife. And yes, I did run back to get another. Adrenaline is one hell of a drug. When I saw him left, I ran to my room and then I called the cops. They came quickly and just took fingerprints and any DNA samples that they could find. The next morning, I called my parents and they came back around the noon. I don't know why, but I kept the knife lodged into the wall next to the door. So the first question asked is, why was there a knife in the wall? My family then changed the front door with a more heavy-duty one. and they arrested the guy within the same week. One of the cops told me that the guy was thinking that I was going to kill him and try to call the police on an attempted murder. So I guess the moral of the story is hide when someone is robbing your house, or learn how to act like a maniac. First, we will need context. My old house was pretty pumped up on security. We had a finger ID, passcodes on doors, and cameras everywhere, and an automatic security system that could either call the police or play a fake "the cops have been called blah blah blah" kind of audio. And this story happened a few years back. My dad noticed a weird-looking man, pretty covered up, lurking on the street just outside our house. We thought nothing of it since sometimes you get the occasional drunk or high person just wandering around. But this man started to inch closer to our house, first being on the opposite side of our street, and before we knew it, he was basically on our property. We just sort of watched him to see what he would do, and I'm pretty sure that we got bored and walked away and just forgot about it. But then, we started to hear strange noises coming from downstairs, where our front door was. So, we decided to switch on the camera, and sure enough, this guy is banging on our door, trying to get in. Then he looks through a window. He then gives up, and then starts to go around the side. There was a set of stairs that lead to the upper area where we were. He then starts to head up the stairs, which then sent my dad to go to the other side of the house with a knife, and then scream at him. This guy runs down and we don't see him again. Well, that's the end of the story, right? Wrong. This guy comes back again, and I guess he saw that the car was gone from the driveway. My dad had gone to get something, leaving me and my mom at home. And then he looks around. We didn't want to confront this guy, so I had the idea of playing the fake cop alert that could be heard outside. So we played it, and as soon as the guy heard it, he ran. We never saw him again, and never want to. What makes this story creepier is that on the news later, it showed a guy who lurked around houses and killed people had been arrested. And when we looked, it was the same man who was at our house. Usually on nice days, I'm at the park, and during my time there, I smoke. After parking under the tree next to a blue SUV, I start getting high. There are other people at the park, but just us two were parked together with 3 spaces in between. I look over to my left, and there's this old guy leaning into my car window asking me questions. I'm nervous as hell, so I pick up my phone and then start scrolling on Facebook. He then proceeded to ask me my name, and I said Lily. He then asked where I lived, and I pointed in some random-ass direction. He then tells me how he wanted to cook, and that he lives in his $50,000 SUV. And to be honest, I didn't care. So I'm still looking at my phone, and I put out the blunt. And he is now telling me that he is 50, which, to be honest, he looked like he was 70. And he loved how beautiful my skin was. Now, I'm freaking the hell out. I'm high, so I'm nervous and irritated, but I also didn't want to be rude. So I just said, "Oh, thank you." He then said if I wanted to smoke with I could, since he's always at that park. I told him that I had a girlfriend and that I am not interested, and he says, "Well, I guess I'm holding you up." And I replied, "Yes." I start putting on my seatbelt and I turn my car on, and still leaning in my window, he says, I love you. And I just say, okay. He starts walking back to his car, laughing as I'm rolling my shits up. He leaves before me, and I follow him to the intersection. And I did that because I wanted to get his license plate and to see which way he was going. Now I'm paranoid and just driving around because I didn't want to potentially lead him to my house. And when I felt comfortable, I knew he wasn't around. I booked it home and I haven't left since. I know I could have left sooner, but this was my first ever encounter like that at this park. So if you have any good advice for the next time, please let me know. A long time ago, way back when I was young, probably around 9 or 10, I would spend pretty much my entire summer vacation at my grandmother's house, which was lakeside property. The edge of her backyard actually lined up with one of the larger lakes in our area, and it was a really neat place to stay for the summer. I'm pretty sure that my parents did it just to get rid of me for a couple of months, and also to keep my grandmother happy. But I loved it. It didn't feel like I was being exiled from my own home at all. Even better, one year, my aunt and uncle had to move in with my grandmother while they were looking for a new place, which meant that I got to enjoy the summer with all 3 of my cousins. Back when I was that age, my cousin Pete was actually one of my best friends. When he and I would get together, we would be inseparable. He was older than me by only 4 months, so it was almost like we were twin brothers. Always doing the same thing, we enjoyed the same things, and we acted pretty much the same. That is to say, that we were both a bit rowdy and considered the troublemakers. Well, anyways, on to the story. This took place back when I was about 10, going on 11. I was, like I said, a bit of a troublemaker. I was a smart kid, but I also had a bit of a mouth on me, in that I would talk back and make witty quips or remarks to adults that would typically land me in trouble. I guess you could say that I was a bit rude, honestly. The only person that could really put me in my place was my grandmother. She knew the exact tone that would make me behave, and she had a way to make me shut my mouth and be good, typically involving an old fishing rod that belonged to my late grandfather. My cousin Pete wasn't fazed by it whatsoever. He would take the lashing and he would talk back to her, and he was mean to her, which is probably the only thing that I had a major problem with when it came to him. I loved my grandma, and he treated her like garbage. This specific year is, as stated, the year that my aunt and uncle, and also my cousins, had to temporarily move into the lake house. My aunt and uncle still worked, so they weren't home most of the time. My oldest cousin was 17, so he'd landed a job at a grocery store. And my middle cousin, Shannon, wanted nothing to do with us, so it was mostly just Pete and I. On the day in question, we were inside the lake house and I think we were playing the old Nintendo, when my grandmother asked us to help her with some housework. I stood up and I went to leave, and Pete angrily asked me where I was going. I told him that I was going to help Grandma and then asked if he was coming. He sneered at me and said that he didn't want to help the old bat, but he said much harsher words that I'm willing to ever put in the same sentence as my beloved grandmother. I told him that I didn't care if he did help, but I was going to help her. He reluctantly threw the controller down and then said fine, following behind me. We both went to see what we were needed for, and my grandmother asked us to start a load of laundry for her while she made us lunch, and then told us that my aunt and uncle would be home soon, so we needed to hurry. We left the room and went to start the laundry. I turned on the washer and started loading in the clothing that was in the basket by the washer. It was mostly my grandmother's clothes, her shirts, pants, dresses, and all of that. And about halfway into my loading the washer, Pete tells me that he will do the rest and then tells me to move. Obviously, I did. I didn't want to do the laundry, and I was only doing it for her because she wanted me to. As he is filling the washer, he stops and looks at me, then lets out this evil little chuckle and says, "Hey, watch this." He then proceeds to grab the bottle of bleach and pour half of it into the washer, shuts the lid, and walks out of the laundry room. The only thing I remembered about that moment was that I was shocked and appalled at what he did. But I was also 10, so I didn't know what I should do, so I just walked out of the room and let it be. Obviously, that wasn't the end of it. Later that night, when my aunt went to change out the laundry, she pulled the clothes out of the washer, and the night went to hell. My grandmother was crying, and my aunt was screaming, asking who had done that. At first, I was going to let it go, but seeing my grandma cry broke my 10-year-old heart, so I told her. I told her that it was Pete, that we went to do the laundry, and after we had put all the clothes in, he poured the bleach into the washer. Pete tried to deny it at first, but then yelled about it being an accident, that he thought it was the detergent, that he just grabbed the wrong bottle, and he tried everything he could to get out of it, but they weren't having it. I got in trouble for not telling anyone when it happened, but Pete seriously got the bad end of the stick. A couple of days had passed, and Pete was basically grounded to his room. I was allowed to roam the house, but not supposed to play Nintendo or anything. It was that following Saturday, because my aunt and uncle took my grandma out to get new clothes to replace what Pete had ruined. They left me and Pete, who was confined to his room, under the watch of my 15-year-old cousin Shannon, the one that wanted nothing to do with us. Shannon's babysitting skills were lacking, to say the least, mostly because she was always in her room and on her phone, doing whatever it was that she did. That day, just being the three of us, I asked her if I could go swimming in the lake, and to my surprise she said yes. This was surprising to me because I was not supposed to swim in the lake without supervision, but I was about to because she said that I could. And like I said, I was a bit of a troublemaker too. So I got my swim trunks on and I ran out back onto the dock and hopped in. I was enjoying myself while everyone was gone. But then out of nowhere, Pete walked out the back door and just stood on the dock staring at me. He tells me that I'm not supposed to be swimming in the lake without an adult around and that something could happen to me. I told him to buzz off and that I was going to enjoy myself while I could swim alone, and that he should go back to his room before he gets in trouble again. He walks away, and within a few minutes, he walks back out with his swim trunks on. He walks out onto the dock and jumps into the water near me. I was annoyed that he wasn't going to leave me alone. But in the end, it was what it was, and I just went back to enjoying the water. After about a minute or two, he calls me over to where he was standing in the water, and I swim over to him. In a hushed tone, he asked me why I told my aunt that he put the bleach in the washer. I told him that it wasn't right, and that I told her because he had hurt our grandma. He huffed at me, and he told me that I shouldn't have told on him, and that it was my fault that he was grounded for the rest of the summer. I told him that it was his own fault and that he shouldn't do things that he does to get in trouble. Unfortunately, that's one of the last things that I remember about this encounter, because within a moment's time, Pete had his hands around my neck and my head underwater. I remember splashing, and I remember trying to yell, and I remember trying to scratch at him or hit him or do anything that would get him to loosen his grip, but none of it worked. Obviously, I didn't die. I'm here to type this story out, but I know that I came close. The next thing I remember is lying on the dock with my cousin Shannon standing over me, alongside some random guy that I'm assuming was at the lake and saw what happened. And I remember that someone else was basically holding Pete down onto the ground. The next thing that's in my hazy memory of events was being in an ambulance and being checked for. I'm assuming breathing, having the oxygen mask on me, and being talked to by a paramedic. The rest of this story, unfortunately, is what I was told by my cousin Shannon. She said that she was in her room and had actually gone to get Pete to tell him to go outside and swim with me because she was actually going to join us and she didn't want him in the house alone. She said that she went into his room and he wasn't there, and when she had gone to the kitchen where the back door was, she saw him jumping into the lake. She went back to get her swimsuit on, and when she had gotten out back, she actually caught the tail end of Pete holding me under the water. She said that as she ran outside, I had actually stopped flailing, so I was out. She told me that the other guy was a good Samaritan that had actually seen Pete choking me, and that he had run over to help get me out of the water, and that the person holding Pete down was the guy's son. The guy was apparently a nurse and had managed to get me breathing again, but he said that they needed to call the ambulance because I could have brain damage. I was apparently out for a little bit before I faded back into consciousness. Of course, this was probably the worst summer of my life. My own cousin, and at that time best friend, tried to murder me because I snitched on him. I got to spend a day in the hospital and got to experience nearly drowning. If you're curious, my cousin Pete is in prison, but not for this, but for other charges: grand larceny, attempted murder, and assault of a police officer with intent to do bodily harm. Obviously, he never changed, and that summer was the last time that he and I ever spoke. He was in and out of juvie as a teenager, and then moved up to much worse crimes, obviously. So while that summer was full of experiences, it's one that left me a bit mentally scarred. I'm now terrified of water, and really, I hope that someday I can just forget it and go swimming again. Though, that's not likely to happen anytime soon. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough to not feel too isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter, and it was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, as I have never smelled that before around that house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I just ignored it and I went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired, and even though it wasn't even 7 yet, I decided to take a shower and then call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes. I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and I picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone screen and number pad blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright that I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9 or something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and I called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footfalls as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and I ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time that I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one that I was in, and a spare in a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and then into the bathroom. And thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and then hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside of the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and then stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom because they charged back into my room and then turned the light on. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic just a foot or so away from the axis, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. And after a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be put in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs, and I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain that I could climb down without him hearing. And after some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided that it was safe enough to climb down and then call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was that the intruder had flipped my bed over, I assume in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise that I heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and then called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped, all the books, pictures, and knickknacks that I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the box and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. And as far as I could tell though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom, and they found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said that people often use to smoke meth. So they think that he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me that I should stay with family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep, and I moved the shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple of hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day, I called to have the door fixed and then motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and then I added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. But nothing else happened at that house though, and I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed and going to my closet and then climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even kept at it when I moved, except now I go to a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting into the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. Way back when I was a kid, my father, my brother, and I would spend most of our summers off of school out in a certain lake near Ontario, Canada. I'm not going to name the specific lake because I don't want to be more detailed than Ontario. But I'm sure you internet sleuths out there could figure it out with enough time and detail. Anyways, we lived pretty close to the said lake, and my dad was all about nature, so the three of us would spend hours of each day out just on the lake, either on the shore or in our small rowboat fishing. We had a lot of luck out there, and we always caught something. But we were strictly catch and release though. We never kept or ate any of the fish that we caught. After my dad passed away when I was about 15, my brother and I wanted to keep the traditions alive, and we wanted to keep going out to the lake to go fishing in his honor. I know that's a weird way to honor someone, but it was the closest we ever were to our dad, and it was some of the best memories that we'd ever created. Basically, it was kind of like being there with him without him being there. It was a bit emotional, but it was nice. Now, with the backstory of my dad and why we were there out of the way, I think I should kind of explain how this lake was situated. It's a fairly small lake situated in a number of larger lakes, in that it's part of a grouping of lakes and is kind of on its own. It's got a few areas that cove off, and there's actually one section that almost looks like an underwater cave, like it goes under the land that's been lifted a little bit over time. Because of this, it's actually a really good fishing spot for the bottom dweller type fish, namely catfish and bass. we typically would take our small boat onto the lake and then fish in the center. But sometimes, we would fish off the edge. Just near where the cave-like area is, there are a lot of trees and it leads into a decent-sized forest area. Now, this all seems like it's completely boring and irrelevant to the whole thing, but I think it's actually critical to know that this lake is by wilderness in our areas that aren't commonly traversed by people. This story is actually the last time that my brother and I ever went to that lake, mostly because of what happened. This happened around the time that I was 17, so 2 years after my dad passed, in our 3rd year of going together. Everything went as normal. We got out to the lake early in the morning, and we got our small boat in the water, and we were ready to catch some fish. The lake was a bit cooler that morning. It had rained some overnight, but it was also summer, so it was muggy and foggy, and I didn't expect to catch anything, to be honest. But after about half an hour, we had actually had a few hits and caught some smaller fish. About 2 hours into the morning, so somewhere around 7:30 or so, we were floating in the lake and came up near where the cave area was. When I say near, I just mean in the general vicinity, nowhere actually near the cave itself, but we could just see it. I'm sitting there with my pole in the water, and my brother is dozing off behind me. And out of nowhere, we start to hear this weird gurgling noise. We both kind of perk up and look around, just thinking, what the hell is that? When it slows to a stop. By this point, we are both invested, searching around us for bubbles, and then we hear it again. After doing this back and forth for a couple of times, we decided that we should probably head away from whatever it was that was making that sound, mostly because it sounded strange, kind of creepy. Really, it was just weird. We started rowing away from the cave area and back to the other side of the lake when we saw something. It was crawling out of the cave area, and when I say crawl, I mean crawl. This thing was acting like a person would if they were super tall and lanky and living underwater. It grabbed onto the mud at the top of the cave-like area, and it pulled itself up onto the shore. And then, it started crawling towards the woods. The best way I could describe it, take the image of a 7-foot-tall person, slim down any and all fat or muscle so that the skin and the bone are touching directly, paint it mostly dark brown to black, then remove all hair. I have no idea what the hell it was, but it was terrifying. Both myself and my brother saw this thing pull itself out of the water and up onto the shore, then watched it as it crawled out into the woods. As soon as it was out of sight, we got our back ends out of the lake and in the car, and we talked over what it was we should do about this thing. But really, neither of us had any idea. He said we should call the police. I told him that we would sound like we were crazy trying to describe a monster crawling from the lake, and he agreed. My thoughts were that we should just leave and never come back to this lake ever. Like at all, because that thing scared the living hell out of me. It was unfortunate, but that was the last time we went to that lake, and we didn't go back the next year. My brother and I still go fishing. We just do so at Lake Ontario now, and we have yet to see any sort of creature crawling out of the water. But I suppose that there's always that possibility. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also like to thank my amazing patrons, my top tippers, and my dearest channel members. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it with all of my heart. If you want to support the channel further, you could also choose to become a patron, a tipper, or a channel member. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.